Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 61 of Contemplating Life. This week I want to talk about some of the great friendships I had in my college days. As I mentioned last episode, this is a difficult one to write because it's about people who are still an active part of my life. While I like these stories to be tell-all, especially when it gives me a chance to confess some of my stupid behavior, some stories are better left private. As I mentioned in previous episodes, we didn't have a regular cafeteria in the K building at the 38th Street campus of IUPUI. It was just a big lunchroom with lots of tables and chairs. Adjacent to it was a vending machine room where you could get stale ham and cheese sandwiches, horrible pizza, snack food, and soft drinks. There was a microwave oven you could use to heat up whatever you purchased. The room also became a hangout for a group of friends to socialize. Early in the morning, someone would break out a deck of cards and start a euchre game. Sometimes the game would last until dinner time. People would come and go and take your place if you had to go study or go to class. There was a crazy guy named Mark, who was a tall, blonde-haired guy who talked way too loud and often said very embarrassing and misogynistic things that occasionally made you embarrassed to be at the same table with him. But except for his unfortunate lack of a filter, he was a really great guy and a life of the party. There was another guy named Kevin, who was fortunately much more restrained than Mark, but still a fun guy. And very smart. I don't recall what his major was. There was a guy named Gilly who would come to school with a cup of coffee from White Castle that he had spiked with some sort of alcohol. Even at 10 a.m., you could smell alcohol on his breath. He was extremely intelligent and fun to be around, a talented card player. My guess is he probably dropped out at some point because of his drinking, but I don't know that for a fact. There were a few women in the group. Sadly, I don't remember most of their names. There was one friendly gal named Cindy who had short red hair and rode a motorcycle. We went out to the movies and to dinner a couple of times, but it never got serious. I've lost touch with all of these people. I've tried doing Google searches and Facebook searches, but most of their names are just too common. You get lots of people with the same name. We've already talked at length about my late friend Mike Gregory, who was part of this motley crew. There was also a computer technology major named Frank Williams, who was a good buddy. Computer technology is slightly different than computer science, which was my major. The details aren't important right now. Frank is an excellent keyboard player. He had his own band in college or shortly thereafter. I went with my friends Rich and Kathy to hear him play at some bar on the east side one time. I think Frank sees himself as a Billy Joel type person. He played lots of Billy Joel songs, and he could also play a few Keith Emerson pieces from the band Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Keith Emerson is my favorite rock and roll keyboard player. Frank liked to call me Christopher, even though I repeatedly told him my actual given name is just Chris. So to retaliate, I decided to start calling him Frankfurter. I told him, if you can put a Topher on the end of my name, I can put a Furter on the end of your name. The nickname was especially appropriate for him because frequently he would bring a bag lunch of hot dogs. He would take 2 hot dogs, slice them lengthwise, and put them between 2 slices of white bread. Then he would microwave the sandwich and load it up with copious amounts of ketchup and mustard. He would then bite into the sandwich, and the ketchup and mustard would drip all over the place. It was a sight to behold. After graduation, I kept in touch with him briefly. We had a little reunion at my house a few years after college. one time when Mike Gregory was back in town for a visit. But then I lost touch with him for many years. Finally, just a few years ago, we reconnected on Facebook. With a common name like Frank Williams, I didn't think I'd ever find him, but I finally did. Frank is still playing in a band. Last summer they were playing at a church festival on the south side, and I went to hear him. It was the first I'd seen him in probably 30 years. He's not the lead in the band, he just plays keyboards, but he does sing lead vocals on some songs. The guitar player is the lead. Frank sounded fine, the lead singer sounded okay, but for some reason I don't think their voices mix very well. I think I liked this old band better when he was the leader, but this band isn't half bad. Anyway, it was still great to hear him and talk to him for a few minutes after the performance. It's great to be in touch with him via Facebook after all these years. Frank had a girlfriend named Kay, who also attended IUPUI. They'd been dating since high school, but somewhere along the way in college, they broke up, even though everyone thought they'd be together forever. I was also able to connect to Kay on Facebook recently. As I alluded to in the last episode, the most important and long-lasting friendship from my college days is with my dear friend Rich Logan. I met Rich in the CS300 Assembly Language Programming class that I talked about last week. We hit it off as friends immediately, and it's lasted almost 50 years. By the way, speaking of that assembly language class, I finally found my little green card. You can see an image of it in the YouTube version. There was a rec room across the hall from the lunchroom. It had about a half dozen pinball machines, a foosball table, and several pool tables, along with other tables for playing chess or other board games. Rich and I played pinball together, but I could only work one of the buttons. So I would sit on the left side of the machine and work the left flipper. Rich would fire the pinball on the right side and work the right flipper. I never was any good at it, but we had lots of fun. In the summer of 1976, there was a sci-fi movie named Logan's Run. Because Rich's last name is Logan, a bunch of us decided we needed to go see the movie together with him. Rich recalls he was the only one of the group who had not yet seen the movie, but I don't think I'd seen it either. As best as either of us can recall, it must have been in late August or early September 1976. The problem was, how do you get me to the movies? I called my mom using a payphone. There had no cell phones in those days. I told her a bunch of us wanted to go to the movie one afternoon. I asked her if Rich could come by, pick up my van, bring it back to IUPUI, and drive me to the movie. Then he would return the van to my house and get back in his car and leave. Mom quickly agreed. Rich loves telling the story about the first time he ever met my mom. He couldn't believe he could walk up there, being a total stranger, and say, I'm here to get your van. And then she just handed him the keys and let him drive it away. He said, I thought, what kind of crazy lady is it that would just trust me with her car and trust me to drive her disabled son to the movies when she'd never met me before? I explained to Rich, it probably wasn't easy for her. She probably was really worried. But she also trusted me, and I trusted you, and so that was good enough. It's also a testament to how far my mom would go to give me a life that was as normal as possible. It's normal for a guy to want to go see a movie with his college friends. If that's what it took to make it possible, she was going to do it. The movie was about a guy named Logan in a future where people were not allowed to live past the age of 30. At birth, they had a small glowing crystal embedded in the palm of their hand. As they aged, it would change colors. When you turned 30, your crystal began blinking red. Then you would participate in a ceremony called carousel, in which people would be exploded in a grand spectacle. But the people were told that the small percentage would be renewed. The people in the audience would shout, "Renew! Renew!" as the victims exploded. But it seemed like nobody ever knew anyone who actually was renewed. The people who realized that carousel was actually a death sentence would refuse to participate in the ceremony. They became so-called runners. Logan was a type of police officer known as a Sandman. It was his job to chase down runners and terminate them. Logan was sent on an undercover mission. They turned his crystal blinking red to make him a runner, even though he was still only in his mid-20s. He was supposed to track down an underground movement that would lead runners to a legendary place called Sanctuary. When Logan inquires, "When my mission is over, do I get my years back?" the computer that gave him the assignment refused to answer. So now Logan really was a runner. After watching the movie, our buddy Mark decided to start calling Rich by the nickname Runner, and he went by that nickname for quite some time. I don't think I used it much, if at all, except perhaps when we were all in the group. There was a woman in the group named Kathy Willard. At first it was hard to get to know her. Richard described her as a quiet, shy girl who was always reading a book. But many in the group never bothered to try to get to know her. Fortunately, one day Kathy and I sat down together and had a very long heart-to-heart talk, where I did get to know her really well. And once we got to know her, she was an amazing person. But few people bothered to take the time to listen to her and to get to know her. They just wrote her off, which was quite unfair. Had I written her off as unapproachable, I would have lost out on an amazing friendship. As previously explained, my approach towards women was that anyone who showed any kindness was immediately categorized as a potential girlfriend. And once I got to know Kathy, she could have fallen into that category very easily, except for one thing. Even though I think she was about 19 years old at the time, she did not have a driver's license. I'm sad to say that was a deal breaker for me. So although I was quite fond of her, I never really considered her a potential girlfriend. One of the people who took the time to get to know Kathy and to truly appreciate her was Rich. I'm pretty sure that Kathy went with us to see Logan's run, and somehow I'd speculated years later that that was the beginning of their relationship, their sort of first unofficial date. But according to them, their first real date was to see a re-release of Disney's Fantasia. According to Wikipedia, that re-release was in April 1977, but I have no idea when they actually saw it. When the gang learned that the two were dating, there was lots of gossiping about it. At one point, the gang witnessed Rich and Kathy disagreeing about something. After they left the room, someone said, well, I'm embarrassed to say it might have been me that said, they speculated it wouldn't last 2 weeks. Anyway, whoever said it first, me or somebody else, everyone agreed. Well, when that statement got back to them, naturally they didn't appreciate it. Over 45 years later, they're still together, and they still argue. When I reminded Rich of that recently, he said, "Yeah, we just stayed married despite everyone. We're still waiting on our pool winnings." Well, although we never did actually wager any money, if we had, Rich and Kathy would have taken a lot. There was a bit of tension between the three of us. I grew jealous of the time they spent together. I think they thought I was jealous because maybe Rich had stolen Kathy away from me, or that we were competing for her attention. But that wasn't the case. As I explained before, Kathy's inability to drive made her ineligible, even though I really liked her. What really happened was Kathy got between me and my best buddy. I was jealous she was stealing Rich away from me, not Rich was keeping Kathy from me. But we worked it all out, and we've been friends for decades now. There have been good times and bad times, and we've shared them all together. Sometime in March or April of 1979, my disability got worse. I developed congestive heart failure and landed in the hospital for 2 weeks. Rich and Kathy visited me frequently and continue to visit me nearly every time I'm in the hospital. Rich also came to visit as I was recovering at home. I remember one day we tried to hook up my Atari 2600 game system to my bedroom TV so I could play video games with him while I was in bed. We finally got it all hooked up and working, and then I realized I couldn't work the controller while in bed. My hands were too weak. So Rich played solo for a while, and I just watched. About 30 minutes later, I realized I'd fallen asleep. When I woke up, he was just quietly sitting there by my bedside, keeping me company. When I was finally able to get out of bed briefly, he came by for a visit, and we sat in my family room. He said he had a favor to ask. He wanted me to be the best man at his wedding to Kathy. I was honored, of course, but I explained I wasn't sure I'd be well enough in time for the wedding. At the time, I could only be out of bed a couple hours a day. He told me he had a plan B. Frank would be his backup best man. My mom took me to the rehearsal the day before the wedding. It was a Protestant church used by Rich's family. Kathy and her sister, who was maid of honor, and I were all non-practicing Catholics in a Protestant wedding. Rich and Kathy's parents, my mom, and perhaps some other family members were there for the rehearsal. There couldn't have been more than 8 people in the church. Rich and I were at the altar. Kathy's father led her up the aisle. The preacher says, "Wait a minute, don't you people know you're supposed to stand up when the bride comes down the aisle? This is your rehearsal too. You need to rehearse your part as the audience." So everybody stood up. I turned to Rich, I said, "Yeah, that's the way it is with these religious people. You never know if you're supposed to stand up, sit down, kneel, cross yourself, or whatever." We both cracked up. It was especially funny because that's what Protestants always say when they come to a Catholic church. Here we had 3 former Catholics in a Protestant wedding, and I was feeding the same lines that Protestants always feed about Catholics. Now, my only official duty as the best man was to hand Rich the ring. We practiced many, many times. He would hold out his hand, palm up, beneath my hand, and I would drop the ring into his hand. I did not want to embarrass myself by dropping the ring. On June 23rd, 1979, Rich Logan and Kathy Willett were married, and I was fortunate enough to be there as the best man. Frank was on standby. I successfully dropped the ring into Rich's hand as we had practiced. Kathy's sister handed her the ring, and they dropped it. It rolled all over the floor. Now, I'm not generally the kind of person who takes pleasure in someone else's misfortune, but I was so happy that if a ring was going to get dropped, it wasn't me who dropped it. They had a small reception at Rich's parents' house and in his backyard. Frank got them a particularly nice wedding present, He knew they didn't have a honeymoon planned, so he rented a fancy suite at a downtown hotel. He ordered a steak and egg breakfast for them, even though it wasn't on the menu. Together we chipped in some cash so they could have some spending money. That was in addition to whatever other gifts I got for him. I don't recall what my wedding present was. That day, I spent a total of 5 hours out of bed between the wedding and the reception afterward. It was the longest I had been out of bed for nearly 3 months. As I mentioned in other episodes, we went to see the original Star Wars with the Logans. We went back a year later to see it again. We saw all of the Star Wars films together, except for Rogue One. We couldn't go to that one because I was in the hospital getting my trach installed in 2016. But a little over a year ago, they re-released Rogue One in theaters. So we went back and saw it together, even though we had already seen it on streaming or DVD. That completed the set. We've seen every Star Wars movie in a theater together, some of them more than once. The three of us frequently went to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway on qualifying days and had a wonderful time there together. We saw many track records broken on several of those days. Here's another fond memory. Rich and I went to a very memorable Colts game on Halloween night in 1988 against the Denver Broncos. It was carried on Monday Night Football. The Colts clobbered Denver 55-23. Our fans began taunting John Elway, the Denver quarterback, every time he made a mistake, shouting, "Elway, Elway," to mock him. Longtime Colts fans will tell you it was one of the greatest games we ever played, and Rich and I were there to see it in person. It was a great event and a fond memory. In those days, my family owned a cabin on a lake in Brown County. Rich and Kathy were frequent guests there. The YouTube version of the podcast shows some of the fun times we had at the lake. The video is from 1984. We've seen countless movies and sporting events together, way more than I can remember. And I have other stories that I will save for appropriate times. Rich is the brother I never had, and Kathy is a very dear friend. I could not ask for more loyal and caring and loving people in my life. They really are extraordinary. Now, it hasn't always been smooth sailing. We've had our ups and downs, our misunderstandings and disagreements. Even the production of this episode has been a challenge we had to work through together. When I used to teach Catholic inquiry classes at my church, there was a lesson about Old Testament prophets. While we normally think of a prophet as someone who predicts the future, a big part of the job is to be a spokesperson for God, sort of like a press secretary. Typically, a prophet's message is to call you back to God when you go astray. Most of the prophets spoke to the entire chosen people, but occasionally a prophet's guidance is personal, as in the case of the prophet Nathan, who was best buddies with King David. Nathan didn't hesitate to tell David what an ass he was being for having an affair with Bathsheba. I teach that sometimes we're called to be prophets to our friends, or to have them be prophets to us, and call us back when we go astray. That's the kind of relationship I have with the Logans. They love me enough to let me know when I screw up, and they know that because I respect them and cherish our friendship, I'll listen to them and try to do better. There are a lot of examples. One day I told a horrendously sexist joke in a computer class, and later Rich called me out, saying simply, I thought your comments in class today were out of character. I'll never forget those exact words. That phrase, out of character, never had more meaning than it did that day. What he was saying with those three simple words is, the Chris that I know and love isn't the kind of person who would say such a thing. The Chris that I know and love is better than that. He was right. That may have been who I was in that moment, but it's not who I normally am, and it's not who I aspire to be. True friends see the best in us and motivate us to be the person they know we can be. The occasions when the Logans have been a prophet who called me to be my better self far outnumber the occasions when I've returned the favor. Scripture says, a faithful friend is a life-saving elixir, and I've been blessed by many such friends. I've been running with Logan for nearly 50 years and look forward to many more years of Logan's run and a blessed friendship. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You'll get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. Although I have some financial struggles, I'm not really in this for the money. Still, every little bit helps. As always, my deepest thanks to my financial supporters. That support means more to me than I could ever express. Even if you cannot provide financial support, please post links and share this so I can grow my audience. I just want more people to hear my stories. All my back episodes are available. Check them out if you're new. If you have any comments, questions, or other feedback, please feel free to comment on any of the platforms where you found this podcast. I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.